Keith asked me to do, I'll mention quickly about the camera and the setup that we have now. We've been working on this for a little while. But we have a camera set up in the back of the door, which of course is not bothered, it's just there. But it's not really in the way, it's kind of out of the way, hopefully. But that camera, along with the computer that we got recently, will allow us to, at this point we're not choosing to stream, but it will allow us to record each lesson that we have here, and it will be available online. It will be on YouTube. All you would have to do is go to YouTube's main page, and you would type in Maple Avenue Church of Christ. I believe we're the only one that's actually named Maple Avenue Church of Christ that will appear there, and it will have a picture of our building as the logo, and all of our past lessons now will be there for you to listen to and to watch. And also we'll try to share those to the Facebook page every week as well, so you can go to Facebook, to the Maple Avenue Church of Christ Facebook page, and be able to watch that there also. So hopefully that will be an assistance to our own members, as well as a way to reach out to the community through those videos, those lessons being available online. But as far as this morning goes, we have a lesson that is asking a question, and the question is, how many will be saved? Now eventually we'll get to Luke chapter 13. If you want to open there, we will look at several other lessons as we get to that point. There's several other verses on these. So when we ask this question, though, the answer really is quite simple, but it's also not answerable, and it's an easy question, but also a difficult question. That makes sense, right? It depends on what perspective we are using when we talk about this question. From a worldly perspective, the question, how many will be saved, is hard to answer, and it is emotionally charged. But if we look at it from God's perspective, it is a simple reality. God looks at it and answers the question, well, I know how many will be saved ultimately, but also there will only be some or few that are saved. That's God's simple answer. And we'll take an in-depth look at that this morning. But as we look at this question, we also have to ask, why do we have to ask this question in the first place? And the answer is because there are different extreme views that people hold in regard to this question. So how many will be saved? It depends on who you ask. Some people on one extreme will say that there is a limited number of those who will be saved. Now, the most often used figure in this limited number comes from Revelation chapter 7 and verse 4, where it talks about there being 144,000 that will be saved. And we've covered this in our class on Revelation, but we know that in that context, it appears to be a specific group at a specific time that will be saved. And aside from that, they're all mentioned as being symbolically Jewish that will be saved at that time. There's not any real way that this applies directly to how many will be saved. But that's one extreme to say that there's a limited number that will be saved. So on the other extreme, you have the answer to the question, who will be saved, as everyone will be saved. Now, there are some that believe that God is just so loving and just so gracious that literally every person on earth will be saved, regardless of what they do. Now, that is even more extreme than the usual extreme. And the usual extreme here would be that everyone who believes in God will be saved. Everyone that says, I believe in God, everyone that says, I believe in Jesus will be saved. I would still consider that to be an extreme view. Why? Because that's not what the Bible tells us. So those are the two extremes, but like normal, the truth will be somewhere in the middle of both of these. There's a balance that has to be found here. And the balance is not a set number, and it's not a free ticket for every person, but it's somewhere in between those. And then one more question about the question, which is why should we ask this question, and why do we need to ask this question? Well, we need to be able to defend what the Bible says about how many people will in fact be saved. Why don't people know the answer to that already? Well, either one, they ignore the Bible. They don't care what the Bible has to say in the first place, and they might not even believe that people will be saved or not saved because they don't believe in an afterlife. So that's one possibility. Some people, even that do claim to be Christians, will ignore the Bible Why? Because they don't want to hear anything about condemnation. They don't want the risk of someone being lost, so they will ignore that entirely. The other alternative is that people do not know the Bible. It's not that they don't want to know about their Bibles, they just don't know them. And if you don't know your Bible, then obviously you're not going to know the answer to this question. But that's the question and the answer that we're looking at this morning. And I will give you two answers to this question, and they are exact opposites, so that's really convenient for us. But the first answer is this: how many will be saved? Very many. Very many people will be saved. And I don't know an exact figure on that, but I know that a whole lot of people will be saved. One example we find of this is in Revelation chapter 7, just 2 verses after the verse that mentions 144,000 being there. It says, "After this I looked, and there was before me a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb." This group is innumerable, at least as far as God is concerned. He cannot count the number of people that are present, the number of people that are saved evidently in heaven. This does not appear to be a group of angels within the context of this chapter, but rather those who are saved, those who are wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. So how many will be saved? Very many. So many that it cannot be counted. How else do we know that many people will be saved? Another example comes from John chapter 14 and in verse 2, in these famous words where Jesus says, "In my Father's house there are many mansions," as the New King James would translate it. As the NIV has it, there are many rooms. That's probably a better understanding of the verse. But either way, there is a lot of space. Now, on Wednesday nights, we've not gotten to the point yet of talking about the size of heaven, as John will measure it out shortly. But when we do get there, it is miles and miles across, at least figuratively speaking. But the idea is the same. Heaven is very big. It's massive. And why would it be massive if not to hold people that will be saved? Why would God design a place for the saved if, in fact, there are not that many to fill up the space? So there will be very many people that are saved. And in a similar way of looking at this, God has been saving people for thousands of years. God has been saving people even before the Old Covenant was made. He saved people during the time of Moses' law, and He saves people now today in the time of the Christian age. God's been saving for thousands of years, and across those thousands of years, millions of people have been saved. Hundreds of millions likely have been saved. And yet, there's another answer to this question. How many people will be saved? Very many people will be saved. But how many people will be saved? Very few will be saved. Now, how is it possible that both of those answers can be correct? How is it possible that very many will be saved and also very few will be saved? Well, it depends on your perspective. We'll look at that in a second. But one example where we see this mention comes from Matthew chapter 13, or chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. It says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it." Verse 14, "But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." So in this verse, as well as Matthew chapter 22, verse 14, where it says, "Many are called, and few are chosen," we have the same concept pointed out, that few people will be saved. Again, how can many people be saved, but also few people be saved? Those seem to be contradictory, but it all depends on our perspective. First point of perspective is this. Consider the world's population. Currently, the world has some 7.6 billion people in it, which is a whole lot of people. And even today, if we were to say that there are many people, we would be right. If we were to say that there were only some of them being saved, that could mean very few. But we're not just talking about the present day population, but also the population for all time. Now, there are different estimates that you can get as far as how many people have ever lived on course, that depends on whether or not you are a creationist or an evolutionist. But there's an estimate that sounds reasonable enough of about 100 billion people that have ever lived on the face of the earth. That's a lot of people. Now, that being said, how many of those have been saved? Apparently, few. If we look back to just today's population and we look at those percentage, the percentage of people that claim to be Christians, that claim that they know God, that they love God, however you want to phrase it, the people that claim to be Christians make up 31% of the world's population. I don't know if that number surprises you, whether on the high side or the low side, but 31%. Now let's just say, for the sake of argument, that 31% of people were saved. 31% of 7.6 billion, is that very many people? It is very many people, but it's also very few as compared to the whole. So when we look at this, we see very many, but also comparatively few. Now that's also the definition of the word that we're looking at when we see it in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. If we define this word few, found at the end of verse 14 here, if we define the word few not in English, where we might say the number 3, or just a handful, or something like that, instead few from the Greek means little, or small, or brief, depending on how it's used, how it's applied. But the word is oligos, and it means, the best way to translate it as far as this application goes, is few as compared to the many. So again, it all depends on our perspective. If we look at the whole of the world's population versus the few that will be saved, it is true at the same time that very many people will be saved, but also very few will be saved. Now, it doesn't really matter what number you put with that. If out of the entire history of the world, out of that 100 billion in theory, what if, let's say, 5 billion of them were saved? What if 50 billion were saved? Would it still be few, and would it still be many? The answer has to be yes. So when we compare these things, when we understand that it's a difference of definition, that starts to make sense. James 4, verse 14 is here for a specific reason. It says, why you do not even know what will happen tomorrow? What is your life? You are but a mist or vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. The word little, translated there, is the same Greek word as few. I think it illustrates our point well to say that life is long. I think most of us could say life is long. We'd also say life is short. But if I lived for 100 years, I lived a long life, right? But in the grand scheme of eternity, was it a long life or was it short? It's compared to the whole. As long as life may be, it's but a brief time compared to the everlasting realm of eternity. And so it is with population. Even if there are many who are saved, ultimately few will be saved. But how few is few? And that's a hard question to answer, but it's easier because Jesus has asked that same question. In Luke chapter 13, the text was read for us. In verse 23, again, it says, the man asked him, Lord, are there few who are saved? Again, the same word being used here. And he said to them, strive to enter through the narrow gate, for many, I say to you, will enter, or will seek to enter, and will not be able. When we read that Jesus responds, he's asked the question, will only a few be saved? And Jesus says, no, everybody will be saved, right? He says, well, as long as you believe in me, you'll be saved. Well, I think everybody's probably going to be okay. That's what Jesus responds with, right? Jesus says, when asked the question, will only a few be saved, he says, strive to make sure that you're one of them. He says, make sure that you're going to be one of those who do enter by the narrow way. He doesn't combat the question. He understands and he implies that the question is true. Only a few will be saved. So make sure that you are one of them. He goes on to speak a little bit more in the next couple of verses. Verse 25, he gives this illustration. He says, when once the master of the house has risen up and shut the door, and you begin to stand outside and knock at the door, saying, Lord, Lord, open for us. And he will answer and say to you, I do not know you, and where are you from? And then verse 26, as he illustrates this, he gives the response from the people. They will say, we ate and drank in your presence, and you taught in our streets. But he will say to them, I tell you, I do not know you, and where you are from. Depart from me, all you workers of iniquity. Jesus says something interesting. He says that even those among that crowd that are seeking him, that are seeking God, he says even few of them will be able to enter. It sounds like that Jesus is saying that 31% of people today that claim Christianity, that even among them, few are going to be saved. It sounds like Jesus is saying, doesn't sound like it, but he is saying the same truth here, that even if you say, Lord, Lord, open for us. If they say to him, well, Lord, we're familiar with you. We know you. You know us. And Jesus will say, you weren't following along the narrow way. He'll say to them, depart from me. I don't know you. Even among those who are of the few that are even seeking out God, it appears that Jesus teaches here that few of them will find the truth. That's a scary prospect. But there's another way that we can look at this. Another example, when we ask this question, how few is a few? Now, I can't give you an exact number, at least not now. But I can tell you, at one specific time in history, the exact answer to how few a few really is that are faithful to God and are saved. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20, it says, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built, in it only a few people were saved through water. Only a few, same word being used, were saved. How many? 8. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that today 8 people will be saved. Like I said, I don't think it's a limited number. It's not 144,000, certainly not 8. But what I do know is when God says few, he means few. And sometimes he means very, very few. What do we learn from this lesson? Well, the first thing we learn, hopefully, is the answer somewhat to this question: how many will be saved? The answer, I don't know an exact number, but I know it's few. And I know it is a lot fewer than people think. I know it's a lot fewer than half, just based on everything we read. I know that's much fewer than those who think that there will be many saved will expect. There are few. There are few that will be saved. What does that mean for us? Well, number one, it means that we should not listen when someone says something along the lines of, God is so loving. God is so gracious that he will not punish anyone. He will not allow anyone to go anywhere but salvation. That's certainly not the case. As we've seen throughout this lesson, throughout this time this morning, God is loving, God is gracious, but there are still very few that will seek him, and even fewer that will find him. Same thing is true whenever someone says something along the lines of, we are all going to the same place. We're just taking different roads, different paths, different ways to get there. According to Jesus, according to what we read this morning, there is one way to him. Of course, from John 14, verse 6, he is the one way. But in addition to that, there are a few people who will even seek to go down that straight and narrow path to him. And even few of those will find him. It's not that everyone will be saved, but in fact it is that very few will be saved. Now, as a caveat to all of this lesson is not intended to say that we or that I am holier than anyone else. This lesson is not intended to say that this is the room of people that are being saved. In fact, as uncomfortable as it may make you, there are possibly people, even probably people, in this room that think that they are among the few and are among the many. But this lesson is intended to record Jesus' answer to the question, will few be saved? And Jesus' response, few will be saved, and make sure you're one of them. In our verse, in verse 24 of Luke chapter 13, it says, strive to enter through the narrow gate. The word there for strive is the Greek word that we get our word agonize from. Why does it say that we have to agonize to enter through the narrow gate? Because it's narrow, because it's difficult, because it's hard to do. If it were easy, everyone would do it, right? Jesus says it will be difficult. It may even be agonizing. It will be a struggle. It will be another way of translating that same word is it will be a competition to enter into the narrow gate. So how many people will be saved? Very few, but also very many. How many people will be saved? I don't know the exact number, but I'll tell you this. I know that you have the opportunity this morning to make that number be one more than it was yesterday. This morning you have the opportunity to add yourself to that number, but this morning you also have the opportunity, if you were already part of the few, to add one more, or two more, 5 more, however many more you can reach out to, however many people you can help. You can add that much more to the number that makes up this few that will be saved. And this morning, if you need help doing that, if there's any way that we can help you, we ask that you come forward this morning as we stand, as we sing.